Welcome to our webinar today. So we'll be discussing the role of bees in Australian food production systems. As we know, bees play an important role in food production, and most of the crops that we eat are pollinated by bees or other pollinators, with nearly 2/3 of Australia's agricultural production benefiting from bee pollination. But bees also play a really important role in seed production, and as well as the quality of fruit and vegetables. And today we have three fabulous presenters. If you want to chuck on your video screens, everyone. So here we have, we've got Dr. Romina Rader from New England University. We have Cam Spurr, who is the Managing Director of seedPurity, and Dr. Julian Brown. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and to celebrate World Bee Day. During the webinar, if you have any questions, questions you want to ask our fabulous researchers, during the presentation, you can type in your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. And you can pop them in there, and then we won't answer them straight away. We'll answer them at the end of the webinar, some interactive Q&A as we go along. Actually, we'll all give each other a bit of an introduction now, who you are and what you're doing. Just a brief introduction about yourself.
I'm Romina Rader, and I'm a professor at the University of New England, and I work in agricultural ecology, predominantly the pollinators that visit crops in Australia.
Fantastic. And Cam?
Yeah, my name's Cameron Spurr. As Lee said, we have a research business, seedPurity. We've been involved in pollination research in a whole range of crops for about 25 years, with a really sort of applied focus on crop production.
Fantastic. And Dr. Julian?
Hi, Julian Brown. I'm at the University of Melbourne doing urban ecology these days, but yeah, mostly looking at plant-animal interactions. And previously I've looked at bees and plants in agricultural landscapes and in fire-prone landscapes.
Fantastic, fantastic. And a big thank you to Cam and Romina. They're currently in the field setting up their field work at the moment, so they're flat out. So really appreciate you spending time to join us today and to spread your knowledge to our attendees. So we'll kick off with you, Romina, and your presentation.
Sure. My presentation today is about the role of bees in Australian food production. And I thought I would first talk about the contribution of bees and also other flower visitors to crop pollination service delivery. Then I would discuss some of the factors that are likely to influence how abundant they are in a crop, how efficient they are at transferring pollen, and how to keep them in a system. And then I'd also like to discuss how interactions between animals and plants and animals are important for getting pollination ecosystem services as well as other services in agricultural systems. And then finally, just some simple management strategies that we can do to support pollinators. So the first I'd like to talk about is the honeybee. The honeybee is a really important pollinator for a majority of our food crops in Australia. This is because it's efficient in most crops, and it's also easy to truck around and put in the places that we need pollination. There's also over, I don't know what the latest estimate is, 1,700 or 1,800 species of wild bees in Australia. We have a majority of those are solitary, which means that an individual female will provision a nest, but there can be groups of aggregate females as well. But that's different to the social bees like Tetragonula, this one over here, which is also a hive bee, and I think there's about 30 odd species of those in Australia, and they're stingless bees that are predominantly found in subtropical, tropical north. So we also have other pollinators. So flies in particular are the second biggest pollinator of Australian food crops and worldwide. Ants are also important pollinators, beetles, wasps. And then we've got the vertebrates, which includes the bats, birds, and mammals. And we don't really know much about them at this point in terms of their contribution to crop production in Australia. So I just wanted to show this network diagram, even though it's a messy series of lines. The lines show interactions between the global food crops on the left and the order of pollinators that visit on the right. And I think this is really important to show because on the left, we've got the 200 or 300 global food crops, and the width of those bars shows how many pollinators that they need. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the pollinators. So the bees are covered in yellow, and they're by far the biggest contributor. And then the other Hymenoptera are the wasps, ants, and sawflies. But you can see the second biggest contributor there is Diptera, which is the flies, and also the moths and beetles. This is some of the examples of the work that we've done in Australia and the different visitors that we already know visit crops. The first is raspberry, where we've done most of our work on the northern or mid-north coast of New South Wales. And you can see that in these systems, native bees and honeybees are significant contributors, but there's also some flies in the system. Blueberry is quite similar under that. When you get to avocado and mango, you can see a larger contribution of non-bee insects. These systems are mostly in Queensland, where you get into the tropical systems. And then watermelon's a bit of a mix, and that's mostly Queensland sites from Bundaberg all the way up to North Queensland and the Northern Territory. And that's where you get other taxa like beetles and flies and moths also visiting. This is an example of the wide variety of pollinators that visit watermelon across the world. This was a review that one of my PhD students did a couple of years back. And it just shows that diversity across the world of the different pollinator assemblages. And I think it's important to see that in different places and in different locations at different times, different cultivars, you can see that the contribution to crop pollination varies. It's predominantly honeybees and other bees, but there's also some flies and other taxa in the system. So the next, I'd like to talk more about these variations in abundances and longevity and why. So one example is netting. Karen Santos is a postdoc in my lab, and she did this research in the last year where she showed the differences in netting on farms. And this was done in blueberry on the mid-north coast. And you can see on the y-axis is just the amount of blueberry pollen, which is conspecific pollen. And the three graphs show open, partially netted, and netted. And then we measured the amount of pollen on the blueberry flowers in the middle of the tunnels and on the edge of the tunnels. So what you can see here is the open tunnels had the most pollen, about 100 odd pollen grains as the median. The partially netted, you lose some of the blueberry pollen. So we've got a decline of about 50 grains of pollen as a median, and then netted shows another significant reduction. So this is one of the management factors where we know is influencing pollinator activity and also the amount of pollen moved. Next is the crop phenology. This is some work we did in almond orchards where we looked at honeybee collection of pollen. And this shows that the amount of almond pollen collected is predominantly highest in early season as opposed to late in the season. And this was also the same for non-crop pollen. So non-almond pollen was also predominantly collected early in the season. And we found the same trend in blueberries where most of the pollen is collected early in the season as opposed to late. This is largely because of the timing of these cultivars. So both in almond and this particular type of high bush blueberry, they're grown over the winter. So early is May bloom, whereas mid and late is July and August, which is when it tends to get too cold for the bees. So they tend to collect less and some of them are less active in the system. I'd also like to talk about now understanding more of the interactions and why this is important. One of these interactions is between species. So this is a figure that shows what happens in blueberries when you put honeybees and stingless bees together. So the fruit weight is on the y-axis, and the first lot of dots is just the fruits that were pollinated only by honeybees. And you can see that it varies with taxa. The second red graph is the stingless bees, and the third is when they're mixed together. So you can see that you end up with higher fruit weight when you've got both taxa together. So this shows that complementarity is really important, and we need to have more species in the system so that because they forage differently and visit the flowers in different ways. We also found interesting differences with who visits the flower first. So in blueberry, we found that when stingless bees visit first and they've got short visits, we end up with heavier fruit. But the longer the visit duration, honeybees come in, and then honeybees provide the biggest blueberry fruit weight. So these interactions are really important if we want to optimize agricultural production, particularly in the horticulture, where a lot of the crops and cultivars are dependent upon insects. We need to understand these interactions. Here is a figure which shows those three different groups of berries and differences among cultivars. So on the bottom, we've got all the different strawberry cultivars that are grown in the literature. And on the top, we've got highbush, which is blueberry, and under that is rabbit-eye, which is a different type of blueberry. And then we've got rubus, which is your raspberries. And basically, pollinator dependency varies from 0 to 100% on the x-axis. So when you've got 0, it means that this particular cultivar doesn't really need pollinators. And when you've got up the higher end, up to 100%, these cultivars do need pollinators to provide fruit, good quality fruit. So you can see the huge variation in strawberry, where different cultivars are actually differ in terms of their pollinator dependency. And it's the same with highbush, and the same with rubus, and the same with rabbit-eye. So we need to understand that cultivar level pollinator dependency if we're going to optimize production and optimize the bees in the system. Finally, I'd like to talk about some simple management strategies on farms and how we can support pollinators on farms. So we know that most crop flowers have nectar and pollen, and that we need these resources in the system to support bees and native bees, as well as other non-bee pollinators. So it seems easy just to add flowers, right? But we have found that plant identity can also be important in what the pollinators are using. And this is just some preliminary work that we put in some co-flowering plants into orchards, again in Coffs Harbour on the mid-north coast on berry farms. And we tried to compare honeybees and stingless bee visitation to these flowers. And we found there's quite a difference in the number of visits. So there's some plants that really attract stingless bees. There's some plants that really attract honeybees. And we need to understand this difference in distribution so we know which plants are going to support which taxa. And if we're going to bring them into orchards, we also want to make sure they're not necessarily competing with the blueberry or raspberry crops. This just gives a summary of a flowchart, and it's a paper that we're trying to publish at the moment, which is in revision, and we're trying to understand what are these factors that influence the identity of plants that we might want to put on farms to support pollinators and other insects. And we've learned that it's not just about the plant that the pollinator is visiting. You need to think about whether the plant is compatible with the cropping system. Will it grow in that cropping system if there's acidic substrate, or the growth form? Is the growth form of the plant going to cover the crop plant? Will it attract pests? Will industry be able to manage it? So there's a whole bunch of questions that we need to think about to make sure that the systems that we are choosing and the workflow in terms of introducing plants in the system are actually suitable for industry and government stakeholders. Finally, we talk a lot about floral habitat that's needed for pollinators, but to support wild pollinators, we also need nesting habitat. And this is something that Lena Schmidt, a postdoc in my lab, is working on at the moment, where we're trying to introduce different types of substrates onto farms, nesting stalks and blocks of clay to attract those solitary bees that might be able to then be supported on the farms and have longer life cycles so that we can have them around for pollination. And Julian will be talking about some of these examples in rubus that he's already done in the past. Okay, so in summary, what can we potentially do to support bees and other insects as pollinators? I think the first thing is that we need to better understand their life histories, their reproductive needs, and their nutritional needs for all types of bees and other insects. We also know that having a diversity of these pollinators, both managed and wild, will increase resilience on farms and in our landscapes. And there's a lot that we don't know about the nutritional needs of bees, particularly in terms of what they get out of floral resources, whether they're seeking sugar or whether it's proteins, types of amino acids, types of fats. We don't really understand that at the moment, and that will help us to find the right resources to support bees. The next is generally there's a really strong relationship between native vegetation and wild bee communities, and also managed bee communities to support their foraging needs. So we need to conserve native vegetation in our landscapes to be able to support the biodiversity that's there. We also know that most taxa will respond differently to different types of land use management and different global change drivers. So an example of that, of land use management, was the netting. There's also pesticide use. There's also different types of weeds that are on farms. We need to understand that whole system in order to manage it appropriately and manage those drivers. And we know that simple interventions exist, like floral strips and nesting habitat, but we also need to understand how they fit in with industry and what industry actually needs to ensure that we have uptake and success with this type of management. Thank you. I'll stop there. These are some of the people that have contributed to this work.
That's a fantastic overview, Romina. Thank you so much. And you can see how complex this sort of research is. There's so many factors and confounds that are, that have to be taken into account when you're managing these large properties. And I guess that's part of what bee-friendly farming is trying to do, is to work with our members to promote not just the health of honeybees on their properties, but also native bees with nesting habitat, fresh water, floral resources. And like what you were talking about with your floral resources, there are some specific floral resources that are far more beneficial than others. So that's just wonderful, wonderful overview. So next we have Dr. Cam coming up to talk about bees as vegetable seed crop pollinators.
What I'd like to talk about today, I guess, is a reasonably unique cropping system. So vegetable seed production, our reliance on honeybees, and some of the challenges that you get pollinating crops with honeybees and how we manage around that. And really that's been the background of my research for the last 25 years is working out how to more efficiently pollinate crops. So when we think about the type of crops that bees typically pollinate, maybe not too many people would think of a cabbage or a parsnip or a turnip or those sort of crops, but we have a thriving vegetable seed industry here in Australia, and a lot of those crops actually do rely on honeybees for pollination. Most of these crops are actually 100% insect dependent for pollination. So there's just some images there of the typical crops that we produce here in Australia. We produce a lot of carrot seed, particularly, a lot of brassica seeds, and also onion seed. And those crops are all 100% dependent on insect pollinators. If we have a look at the industry, it's largely export-based. There is a small domestic industry, but the vast majority is exported. It's around about 1,800 hectares of production, and it's worth about $50 million. And a lot of it's open field production. Tends to occur around the southeast of Australia, so southeast South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, and New South Wales. Tasmania probably has the lion's share, and really because of quite a large hybrid carrot seed industry down there. About 150 growers around Australia, and as I said, many crops that depend on insect pollination. What I particularly want to talk about, though, is hybrid seed production systems. So there's a real shift in horticulture towards hybrid varieties because they're more vigorous, they're more disease tolerant, and they're very uniform. And about 75% of the crops that we produce here in Australia are hybrid seed crops. The way those crops are set up, when we talk about a hybrid, we're talking about two distinct varieties that are cross-pollinated to produce the hybrid. Usually we have one variety which is just the pollen donor. For example, in the cauliflower crop at the top there, it's the yellow flowering line that you can see, and in the carrot, it's the shorter white one in the centre of the shot. All that does is provide the pollen into the system. The other line is what we call male sterile. It doesn't produce pollen. The only way it can set seed is for the pollen off the pollinator line to be transferred onto it. And so that puts a real premium on insect pollination, because more than just visiting a flower and starting to pollinate straight away, we actually need them to pick up pollen from one line and move it on to the other. And so it's quite a challenging crop to pollinate. We need a lot of bees to pollinate them successfully. For example, a quick calculation says that we need to deliver about 150 million pollen grains per hectare to achieve a typical target yield on a hybrid carrot seed crop. So we have a lot of need for pollinators, but the physiology of these crops also presents some challenges around pollination we'll talk a little bit about, and some of the management that we do to make that happen. So just to highlight our reliance on bees, and when I talk about bees here, I'm predominantly talking about European honeybees, although we do get a lot of value out of native bees as well, and particularly ground nesting solitary bees in the southeast. I'm based down in Tasmania, and we see a lot of those in the crops. But if you look at the two figures on the right there, they actually show the relationship between bee activity in crops and yield outcome in those crops. And it really doesn't matter which of the key crops, carrots, brassicas, or onions we survey. What we see is that bees really drive the yield outcome. If we get good foraging activity in healthy crops, we get good yields. There's a lot of other insects that visit these crops, but when you look at the relationship, it's the bees that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting at the moment. And that's partly because we stock these crops intensively with honeybees, but also because they're highly efficient pollinators. And that's also highlighted. This is some work looking in carrot at the amount of pollen that different insect types are actually carrying. And the first thing about pollinating is if you're going to move pollen around, you've got to be carrying it. And so the graph shows the pollen loading on the insects. The columns are the average, and the bars actually show the lowest and highest recorded values that we saw with those species. And you can see that really it's the Hymenoptera, and particularly the honeybees and some of the ground nesting bees, that are really important. There are a couple of really good dipteran species as well in the hoverflies, but they're the really efficient ones. There are a lot of other insects that visit, but they're not necessarily efficient pollinators in this system. Okay, so what are the challenges that we face pollinating these crops? And so there are three that I really want to talk about today. Supply of pollinators, first of all, the supply of managed pollinators. How we actually effectively pollinate crops that might have challenging physiology that may not be particularly attractive to pollinators. And one of the key ones is that, particularly in field crops, there are always going to be insect pests that we have to manage. And in some of our vegetable seed crops is a really crucial pest that we have to manage. And unfortunately, the occurrence of that pest coincides with the flowering period. So how do we actually safely and reliably manage that pest to the standard that the market demands for the quality of the seed, but still ensure that we're looking after the pollinators in the crops? So if we look at pollinator supply, and Tasmania is a really nice example here. So we have around about 24,000 registered beehives in Tasmania. There are, with good reason, quarantine barriers, the movement of other hives into the state. So it's the hives in Tasmania that we have to work with. If we take one example, we grow 700 hectares of hybrid carrot. It flowers in December, January. We need 7,000 of those 24,000 registered hives to reliably pollinate that crop. But most commercial beekeepers, in fact, all commercial beekeepers in Tasmania, rely quite heavily on honey production for their income. And there's one honey crop that stands out in Tasmania as being the most important, and that's leatherwood. It also flowers in December, January. So if you're a beekeeper in Tasmania, your primary focus is on leatherwood because that's where a lot of your income is going to come from. But we also have other crops in that critical summer period that also need to be pollinated. So pasture seed, particularly clover seed crops, and there's a lot of berry production in tunnels that also needs to be pollinated at the same time. And so it's a real pinch point for us. Securing 7,000 hives at that time when beekeepers want to go to leatherwood is challenging, and it's required quite a lot of innovation to get around that barrier. We were in a situation 10 years ago where the amount of crop that we actually sowed was dictated by availability of bees, not what the market was actually looking for. So what we've seen is that some seed companies have actually developed their own apiaries geared just towards pollination. And the largest apiarist in Tasmania now is actually a seed production company. We've seen a lot of effort done around stewardship of hives. Beekeepers often have opportunities to go to leatherwood when they've finished pollinating the crop, but they want to take strong hives down to the leatherwood crop. And so it's really important that the crop setting that we're putting those hives in really looks after the welfare of the hive and make sure they've still got a really healthy, high quality hive to collect honey. So a lot of work going on to ensure hive health. And the other thing is that we have to realise that honeybees are fantastic, but sometime we need to look at other alternative pollinators as well, and alternative managed pollinators to pollinate the crops that honeybees aren't necessarily that great at pollinating, but also to pick up the slack when there's a shortfall. And so that's the other thing that we're starting to see happen in Tasmania. Okay, one of the challenges, particularly with hybrid crops, is that a lot of the male sterile lines, particularly, which are the seed-bearing lines, aren't necessarily that attractive to honeybees. A consequence of the sterility is that they tend to have reduced nectar production and they don't produce pollen. What that means is that there are a lot of other things in the landscape that are potentially more attractive for honeybees to forage on. we know, for example, in hybrid carrot crops, about 3 to 5% of the worker bees that are stocked into that crop actually forage on the crop. And a really nice example of when it can all go wrong is when we have a big bloom of something else in the landscape. So the example in the top right is a pollen trap that was mounted on a hive in a crop in Griffith, a carrot seed crop. And so we actually use the pollen returns into the hive to fingerprint what the bees are working on. And what was interesting here is that exactly none of the pollen that was coming into the hive was from the target crop. We had a lot of Patterson's curse, we had a lot of eucalypt, a lot of radish, which were all blooming prolifically after the drought broke. And so that creates real issues because the bees can be attracted off the crops, not work the crop. They're doing very well on everything else in the landscape, but we're not actually setting any seed. So we put a lot of effort into making sure that while we need a diversity of forage, and it's really important and we want that, we try to avoid large flowering events that are going to be problematic. A really nice example of one in Tasmania is prickly box. It's a native species that is a really strong nectar flow. Beekeepers produce a lot of honey off it. But if we have a carrot crop flowering near it, we pretty much have no chance to pollinate the carrot crop. Bees will leave the crop and focus on the prickly box. So there are things that we can do to manage that situation. One is to make sure that the crop that we're presenting is as attractive as it can possibly be. So making sure that we're looking after the crop and it's producing good quality nectar to the best that it can. But it's also a matter of understanding where these big bloom events are going to occur in the landscape and separating your crops from those in space or separating them from those blooms in time by managing the flowering time of your crop. And we have some we use both those approaches. We put a lot of time into site selection, but also manipulating flowering time of the crop where we can to avoid those big bloom events. But the other key thing is to optimise nectar production. And we do a lot of work the way we set crops up. We've done a lot of research looking at the drivers for nectar production. We know that temperature and water potential, moisture stress are really important. This is just a data set of looking at how we can irrigate carrots to improve nectar production. Which has a direct flow on to honeybee activity foraging on the crop and has a direct flow on, as you can see in the graph on the top right there, to seed yield. So the lower refill point, which basically means not allowing the crop to dry out as much before we re-irrigate, of minus 40 kPa, we can see that the seed yield there is substantially higher than if we use a more traditional refill point of 120 kPa. If you have a look in the table below, you can see that the honeybee activity on the plots that were awarded at the lower refill point is much better, and also the nectar production is much better. And we have a lot of data demonstrating that relationship between nectar production and foraging activity. So there are things that we can do to manage the system to improve the odds of our crops being pollinated. From a breeding perspective, we're doing a lot of work on developing male sterile lines that are more attractive. We work with a number of the breeding companies in Europe, and we screen the different morphologies. So there are different, when we introduce sterility into a line, which is basically preventing the pollen production, we get growth of other structures, other petal-like structures, and we can also impact our nectar production there. And so we work a lot with breeders to identify the flower morphologies in those sterile lines that are most attractive to honeybees. And you can see it's the patelliform example of the sterility there that is the most attractive, and it has the increasing likeness to the pollinator flowers, produces more nectar. And when we look at the types of seed yields that come off it from insect pollination, they're much higher. They're much more attractive to the pollinators. They're much more likely to cross from the pollinator line onto the sterile line. If we have bad sterile lines and strong pollinator lines, what tends to happen is they work the pollinator line to the exclusion of the CMS line, and we don't get any cross-pollination, we don't get any seed. So balancing that up is really important. We also, this is Dr. Bjorn Borgman, who we have a collaboration with. He's based at the University of Western Australia, and he looks at nectar volatiles and attractants and repellents in the nectar. And what we're starting to learn is that we see a range of compounds there, some of which are highly attractive and some of which are highly repellent to honeybees and other insect pollinators. And we know that the ratios of those compounds or their occurrence varies widely between lines. So we know that there are real opportunities to screen there and to be able to select the more attractive lines, which is something that's being picked up and used. The other really key one for us is how we, so if beekeepers are going to entrust us with their hives, and we're working mainly with honey beekeepers who want big, strong hives at the time of year that they want them at that way to go to honey collection, then we need to really look after those hives. But we still have to manage insects pests. we do a lot of work routinely screening pesticides and deterrents to look for efficacy and bee safety. And we've built programs that are based around using chemicals that are safe to use and using them in a manner that's safe to use. And we integrate a lot of IPM, a lot of critical control thresholds, so we don't spray until we need to. And some other approaches like introducing trap crops. So there's a nice example from Bejo, one of the vegetable seed companies there, who use sunflowers around their crops to attract the insect pests so that they're on those rather than in the crop. There's a lot of other benefits from having something like that around that Romina's alluded to, where we actually get a benefit for our pollinators off that, and we also get other beneficial insects feeding on the sunflowers as well. So there are dual services that can provide. Most of this work relates to rubber-glen bug, which is an insect pest that damages the seed. The issue has to be addressed in the field. We can't grade it out afterwards, and unfortunately it predominantly visits during flowering, so we don't really have the choice but to control. We spend a lot of time testing and refining, and one nice example of how we do that is a system here that one of our collaborators, Dr. Ryan Warren at TIA, has set up, where he tracks bees using an RFID system. And we can look at how honeybees in a cropping system survive, which is survival curves there in the graph, compared to in a system basically in a natural setting where there's no spraying and that sort of thing going on. And so what we're looking for there is to make sure that in our agricultural system, the survival of those bees, their flight activity and those kind of things is comparable. And you can see in the graph there a nice example of some carrot production where we have had to spray, and through the flowering period, and the flowering period is 8 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks, we've actually had to spray 4 times. But using a combination of bee-safe insecticides, appropriately timed applications, which is night spraying, critical control thresholds and other management practices that we can integrate, you can actually see that there's no difference in the survival curve for honeybees in that system, and also in another population that are located in the bush block away from where we're doing it. So a really nice way of tracking and to be able to provide some evidence that what we're doing isn't harming the hives, and something that we're very focused on doing. Okay, that's probably all I have time for today. So thanks for your time, and we'll move on from there.
Thanks, Cam. That was wonderful, wonderful presentation on the amazing work that you've been doing for a couple of 2 or 3 decades now. It's just seeing all of the work come together and getting some really amazing management outcomes from that research that's practical and can be implemented. So thank you so much for that. Next we have Dr. Julian.
All right, well, I'm going to tell the story of the berries and the bees. So this is about managing native reed bees as pollinators of temperate fruit crops. So Romina covered a bit of this, but I'll just briefly mention why it's important to start looking at managing native bees as crop pollinators. So down in the south of Australia, where we don't have stingless bees, with the research we've done, it's often honeybees that are doing the vast majority of visits to crop flowers. And as Romina mentioned, it's risky to rely on any one species for crop pollination, because if something happens to that species, then pollination suffers. And varroa mite has arrived. So potentially we might see a decline in pre-pollination services from the feral honeybees that are living in the bush, and possibly also increases in the costs of managed hives due to the cost of the miticides. So I'm going to talk mostly about some work we've been doing in and around the Yarra Valley in Victoria. And it's a region that's known for its wine, but there's also a lot of temperate fruit crops that are grown there. So cherries, apples, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, among other things. And so we were interested in what native bees are visiting these temperate fruit crops. And so this diagram's a sort of summary of a few years of research we were doing, similar to one of the diagrams Romina showed. So we've got different native bee groups on the left and crop flowers on the right, and a line connecting a bee group to a flower shows that we found that kind of bee visiting that crop. So you can see there's a few different native bee groups that were visiting the crops. But today we're interested in the native reed bees, Exonura. And we found them visiting every crop we looked at, not necessarily at every site, but they seem to be quite generalist in the flowers they'll visit. And we also caught a bunch of these bees off crop flowers and looked at the pollen they were carrying. And when they were caught on crop flowers, they're often carrying large amounts of the crop pollen, which suggests they might be good pollinators because they're moving that crop pollen around. But to be sure of that, you really need to take the next step and see whether they're putting that crop pollen on the stigmas of the crop flowers and influencing fruit production through that pollination. So we did some of these experiments with cultivated blackberries. Basically, we put little bags around flower buds before they opened. Once the flowers opened, we took the bags off and waited for the first insect to visit the flower. Then when the insect left, we recorded what it was, put the bag back on the flower, and then waited till the fruit was produced and then counted the number of druplets, which is a measure of fruit quality in blackberries. We also had a set of flowers where we didn't let anything visit them, and that's the green bar on the right-hand side of the left figure. And you can see that compared to those flowers that receive no visits, on average, a single visit from a honeybee, a reed bee, or these other native bees, Lasioglossum, the number of druplets was substantially higher. And then there was another group who did similar research with apples. This was a Western Sydney University group, but they were looking at the number of apple pollen grains that were deposited on apple stigmas. And again, they found that native reed bees and Lasioglossum were doing comparable jobs to honeybees on a per visit basis, maybe even a little bit better than honeybees. So this shows that native reed bees and some of these other native bees are equally as good as honeybees on a per visit basis. But remember that honeybees are doing the vast majority of the visits, particularly down in the south. So they're providing most of that pollination service. So what do we know about reed bees in terms of their ecology and natural history? They occur from Tasmania up to Queensland on the east coast, and then a bit in the southwest. And you find them in mountain forests down to coastal heaths, but not so much in the dry inland areas. They're social, so they can live in groups of up to 15 females per nest, and you can have several of these nests close together, so they're not necessarily territorial. They're active most of the year. You can sometimes find them foraging on relatively warm days in winter. And like all other bees, to complete their life cycle, they need pollen and nectar to grow their babies and give themselves energy, and also suitable nesting substrates to lay their eggs in and raise their young. So I'll focus a little bit on the flower resources and the nesting substrates that reed bees need. So we did surveys across more than just crop flowers. We're looking at native plants and weeds in the landscape, and we found that reed bees were visiting a great diversity of plants, but because the crop plants were flowering mostly in spring and summer, and the reed bees are active almost year round, it was really important to have native plants for early in the season and late in the season, before and after crops are flowering, to provide that continuity of floral resources that the reed bees need throughout their activity period. In terms of their nests, so they nest in pithy stems, so stems that have a sort of soft part to them, or old beetle holes. So up in the mountain and the wet forest, they're often nesting in the dead fronds of tree ferns when they fall on the ground. In the heathlands, they nest mostly in the flower spikes of old grass trees, or in beetle holes in eucalyptus and melaleuca and other things. In the modified landscapes, we often find them nesting in wild blackberry or further north in lantana. They'll nest in most garden plants that have a pithy stem, but they need access to that stem. So the branch needs to be broken or detached or dug into by a beetle. So in terms of the kinds of landscapes that reed bees like, the research we did, around the Yarra Valley found that you find a lot more reed bees when there's more native forest in the surrounding landscape, and that's probably because there's more nesting resource in there and a greater diversity of plants providing that continuity of floral resources. But we did find a couple of farms that had very little native forest in the surrounding landscape, but lots of reed bees. And these were raspberry and blackberry farms. And what we actually found was that the reed bees were nesting in the old cane stubs of the raspberry and blackberry. So these were farms where they weren't cutting the canes right down to ground level. They're leaving about 10 centimeters, and the reed bees were building their nests in there. And that's pretty cool because you kind of end up with this almost self-contained system where the reed bees can nest in the crop, in the cultivated raspberry and blackberry, if there's cane stubs, and then they come out and they pollinate the crops. So you've got bees for the berries and berries for the bees. So yeah, just to kind of summarize in terms of managing property for reed bees, they need flowers throughout the activity period, so most of the year, except in the middle of winter. And there needs to be nesting sites. So if you don't have tree ferns or the natural nesting resources, but you do have raspberries or blackberries, you can, when you're pruning, leave a length of cane stub of about 10 centimeters for the bees to nest in. Or if you don't have raspberries and blackberries, we had some success with cutting wild blackberry canes and bundling them up and mounting them on star pickets. And some places we set these up, reed bees made their nests in there, but not always. So there's still something to figure out about their preferences in terms of those artificial nests. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julian. That was amazing. I have to say, Exonera, these reed bees are one of my all-time favourite species of native bees. And I've actually found them, I mean, obviously we want to encourage native plants, but I've found them in my garden when I lived in the Central Highlands of Victoria, nesting in like hydrangeas, bamboo, fuchsia, ornamental currants, and they're just wonderful. They're just sort of anything where they've got that pithy sort of stem in the middle of the dead branch, then they're quite happy to live in there. So thank you so much for that. I will just also let people know about, so this presentation is run through Bee Friendly Farming. It's a certified program. So we, being a Bee Friendly Farming certified member, it supports farmers and land managers to help protect, preserve and promote the health of bees and other pollinators. And our members who are certified, so we've got over about 40,000 hectares certified right across Australia, from Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tassie. And that covers about 12 different industries. And all of our farmers are encouraged to support bees and other pollinators by incorporating affordable, simple, science-based practices. So based on this amazing science by these three researchers, and providing nesting habitat, boosting food resources, increase access to water, and incorporating integrated pest and pollinator management, which Cameron touched on earlier. So I think one of the first questions we had from Jolan, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. It could be Yolan, I'm not sure. So they're interested in a reference for the pollinators of the world, or in general, just a copy of all of your slides, Romina.
Yeah, sorry, I should have put a reference on the bottom of that. I can pop it in the chat. It's annual reviews of entomology.
Okay, all right, that'd be fantastic. We had a question from Peter Debrasini. What was the specific variety of Nepeta? Is that catnip mentioned in your slide?
Yes, I was just looking at that. It was Nepeta cross Fascinii. I don't know, that's what it said on the label.
Okay. Yeah, bees love that.
Yeah.
And then I think in the chat we had a question from Jackie. Hi there, I'm a farmer from regional Riverina near Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. I have honeybees on our farm. Is there a native bee we could introduce or provide habitat for?
I was just chatting to Cameron about this. So we did some work in carrot seed fields down in the Riverina, and we found solitary nesting bees there, which we haven't quite identified yet. They were halictids of some sort, so we still are in the process of getting them identified, but really small, like the Lasioglossums size. And they nest in sort of compact bare earth on the edges of the farms. So I guess keeping those around would mean not cultivating all the soil and still having sort of the banks on the side to maintain those in the landscape. And of course, you know, native floral resources to support them. Didn't you think of anything else?
Yeah, no, I think that the cultivation is a big one. We see a lot of ground nesting bees on the headlands and crops, and if growers are aware of that, they're promoting native bees, but they're also getting a fantastic return out of really looking after them in their crops. So that's one really practical thing that can be done.
And I think a lot of people are interested in stingless bees. Definitely not going to be, you won't be able to have stingless bees in that region. It's just way too cold. Anywhere, you know, west of the Great Dividing Range and as south as Bega, I think it is that's about as far as the range goes for them. They're really tropical and subtropical. So yes, you can keep them in hives, but it's just not going to be, they're not going to survive in those cooler regions. So
no, and it's also a good idea not to move them to where they're not already
that's right, yeah.
native. Yep. So I think the stingless bee colony management is restricted to the kind of northeastern coast of Australia.
Really key things too that Julian touched on is the continuity of forage throughout the season. So if you're thinking about supporting the populations, you need to be thinking about how do we support them through the full season of their foraging and making sure we've got appropriate plants flowering at the right time.
Yeah, that's right.
Not always choosing weeds or you know, that might attract pest taxa or become a problem in their own right. So I think just choosing the plant species effectively.
And I think that's like what you were talking about, Romina, with, you know, you do also have to be quite specific about some of the plant species you choose, because they can also harbour viruses and stuff like that. And it's, I guess particularly for the commercial properties, they need to be really thinking about the type of plant species that are going in. And bee-friendly farming, it's two of the major criteria are to have floral resources on 3% of your property and also have floral resources flowering throughout the year. And we in Bee Foundation have some fabulous planting guides, powerful pollinator planting guides that are specific to different bioregions across Australia. And that will list about sort of 70 to 80 plant species that are indigenous to those different bioregions and specifically supply a good source of nectar and or pollen for our pollinators. So, and that gives you you can choose, it gives you a flowering phenology, so you can choose which plants will flower throughout the year, so pop them on your properties. So okay, we've got a question from Alison. Has there been any research on how pesticide use impacts native bee species? As some are smaller, could they potentially have different responses to honeybees?
Yes, they could certainly have a different response to honeybees. It's not only size but behaviour, and the fact that they are potentially, ground nesting species are particularly close to the crop at times. In short, Romina and I were talking about that, and I don't think we're aware of a lot of research at all in that area, and it's a really critical need. For a lot of species, one of the things that is quite challenging is that they're solitary, so they're not necessarily the easiest species to work with. We know at a practical level, when we're doing pesticide screening trials, when they progress to a field level, we are tracking natives and honeybees there. But we're really only looking at very short-term effects, and the longer-term effects, no, I'm not aware that they're particularly well understood, to be honest.
No, I don't think there's. I know at Western Sydney Uni, Gaurav Singh did some work on the effects of pesticides on stingless bees, on Tetragonula carbonaria. I'm not sure if he's published on that. But yeah, there's not a lot out there, I think, at the moment, unfortunately. So, yeah. Okay, question for Julian. With reference to the artificial nesting sites, were the rubus offcuts enclosed within a plastic pipe?
They were. We put them in polypipe just to sort of protect them from the elements a bit. That did kind of seem to maybe encourage spiders and other things to set up in there. So I don't know if it's the best way to go. But we were just sort of playing around with those artificial nests. We haven't done any research yet to see what designs are best. We got some indication from, so I mentioned that we did some work looking at reed bees nesting in the cane stubs within rows, and we looked at how things like the angle of the cane stub, the diameter, a few other things like that influenced occupancy rates of the reed bees. And we found that the canes that were more upright actually were more likely to be occupied by reed bees. And the smaller diameters, so most Australian bees that will nest in cavities, they don't really like those holes to be more than about 1 centimetre in diameter. So yeah, that's another consideration. You don't want it to be too wide. So often those commercially available bee hotels you get that have, big wide bits of bamboo aren't that helpful for bees.
Good for spiders.
Yeah.
So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Have you engaged the public and policymakers in Australia to support bee-friendly practices and policies? And what successes have you observed in these efforts?
So, we do our best to present our research where we can with government and policymakers, and are invited to various events beyond conferences. But we also, all of us try to work directly with industry stakeholders, from growers right up to peak industry body groups, where the information can then get disseminated among growers. And we also attend community events.
As Romina said, we tend to work more with industry on a day-to-day basis, and I think that a lot of the momentum is actually coming from industry. I think the recognition is there of the value of native pollinators in the system, and certainly with the industry partners that we work with, there's a real desire to enhance native pollinator populations and those services. At a government level, it's not really in my sphere. I'm not really.
No.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more that could be done. But it's just about, I think, getting that recognition and also trying to get the evidence base out there. And you can see that there's still a lot of evidence that we don't have, for example, the pesticide work on native bees. So it's also hard to make a call with some of these things that we don't necessarily have evidence bases for, but we're working on it.
Yeah. But I think, what we're seeing is there is, even these larger industry bodies, the larger commercial farmers are really looking at sustainable ways of farming, and they're really working towards, using integrated pest management and other management methods to reduce the effects, harmful effects of, pesticides and whatnot on farms. So
I might just also add, in the future, there's going to be a lot more accountability for industries and businesses and corporations to report on how they're supporting biodiversity and ecosystem service delivery,
yeah,
both in farming landscapes, but also other industries like mining and etc. And they are going to need to have sustainability indicators and ways of reporting on this, and to disclose their impacts. So I think that's probably a good conduit for this kind of research. Yeah,
absolutely. So from Gary, he said, I know Gary, he's a Bee Friendly Farming certified member from Western Australia. He said the variability in diameter I find works with our resin bees, from kangaroo paw to bamboo to bamboo, but less than 10 millimeters. I know I did some work in my previous role as a researcher for a private vegetable seed company, and we found we looked at the different diameters of whole size in drilling in eucalyptus blocks, and we found that specifically for the resin bees, it was between sort of 6 and 8 millimeters was the best. 6, 7, 8 millimeters was the best for resin bees. So from Lydia, have had more success in closing with terracotta pipes and natural timber. The plastic seems to sweat and may deter chemically too. Haven't explored latter. Yes, very successful abode for spiders though. I had one for you, Romina. I was interested in when you were talking about, you put up a slide of the different strawberry cultivars, and it literally went from zero pollination to, up to sort of 80, 90%.
Yep.
So the ones that have zero pollination requirements, what's the fruit like? Is it as good as the fruit produced from pollinated?
Some of these varieties are parthenocarpic, so they can hormonally produce fruit just from the impetus of having self-pollen. I was saying earlier that this is a review that's all the published literature, so the Australian data is not necessarily in there if it hasn't been published yet. So there's still some local studies in Australia from other researchers that we need to include in there. But essentially you're still getting fruits that might be smaller, but they're fully formed. It's the same with blueberries. Yep.
They taste as good.
So often the quality is what improves with pollination.
Yeah.
But it also is highly dependent on the cultivar.
Okay. From Yolan again, do you think we have lost many native bee species due to deforestation, loss of grasslands and native tracts of land, and pesticide use?
Yeah, look, I think there's clear trends with land use change in the world, and deforestation in particular, and how that affects biodiversity per se. I don't know about clear specific studies with pesticides yet in Australia. But we certainly have to be aware of those, that there are strong relationships with the native vegetation and bee biodiversity. So I think, the land use change and increasing intensity is probably likely to cause changes in populations. But I don't know about the huge evidence base yet that I've seen. And it's also tricky because wild populations are really variable, and change in weather conditions and change with other environmental factors. From year to year, it's quite hard to show long-term changes when there's also this natural variability.
And also we just didn't have the knowledge. It's only recently, the last few decades, where we've actually having research done on our native bee species. We didn't even know what we had before that. We don't know what we've lost because we didn't know what was there to begin with. So well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to sincerely thank our presenters today. I know you're all very busy and some of the top researchers we have in Australia, so it's a real privilege to have you here, and really appreciate your time given to us and Ween Bee Foundation. News.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. And sorry, I just remembered that our CEO Fiona Chambers went to Slovenia over the weekend, and the Ween Bee Foundation has won the Golden Bee Award for World Bee Day. So it was
Very good.
Fantastic. Well done.
So yeah, very exciting. So happy World Bee Day, happy World Bee Week. Hop onto, there's lots of other presentations and activities still going on around World Bee Day. So yeah, enjoy. And thanks again to you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
See ya.
Anyways, ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Hey, best mellifera, we love what you do. A third of crop production depends on you. Honeybees, yeah, well, they get all the glory. But there's other key players in the pollination story. But you never know this if you looked at the news. All you hear is stories singing about the honeybee blues, yeah. In the media, bees have all the buzz, and it's really quite a problem, and it bothers me 'cause we need the wild pollinator in agriculture too. Wild pollinator, most people have no clue. Wild pollinator, they're pollinating too. And honeybees, sometimes you need their help, yes, it's true. Now do you know that some of our native flies are pollinators and they're helpful allies? For mango growers, blowflies are their best friend, 'cause they visit those flowers again and again and again. They transfer pollen at astonishing rates. It's unfair that these flies get so much of our hate, yeah. A juicy mango's one of my favorite things, and that's thanks to these flies and all the pollen they bring. We need the wild pollinator in agriculture too. Wild pollinator, flies, moths, and beetles too. Wild pollinator, they're pollinating too. And honeybees, sometimes they do it better than you. Well-managed honeybees, they face many threats, from poor nutrition to diseases and pests. Environmental changes can play a role in affecting the pollination services as a whole. So diversity of pollinators may be key for the future of global crop production stability. If we want fruit and veggies on demand all year round, we'll need both wild and managed pollinators to abound. We need the wild pollinator in agriculture too. Wild pollinator, we need to change our view. Wild pollinator, they're pollinating too. And honeybees, sometimes you know they are helping you.